Hello and welcome to our tour of the City of London. Today we're going to be exploring some really significant places in the history of our medical knowledge, in the history of our churches, and some ancient Roman places as well. I hope you enjoy the tour. In Postmans Park, so named because it was a popular oasis for postmen to take their break after a hard morning's delivering letters in the city. It became a park in 1880 after it was decommissioned as a burial ground for St. Bartholomew's Aldersgate, and it's quite a charming little oasis in the centre of London. Behind me is a really unique memorial to the bravery of ordinary people, and details the names and deeds of many ordinary people who gave up their lives in order to save others. This memorial was commissioned by George Frederick Watts. He was a painter and sculptor in the late 19th century. He long saw art as a means to bring about social change. Here we have a plaque dedicated to Walter Pert and Harry Dean. These two men were the driver and fireman of a steam train that was the 4:15 steam train from Windsor to Paddington. So what happened on this particular day is that they noticed along the route that there was a control rod that was not up to scratch, and they made a note of this and wanted to make sure that once they got to the terminus they would be able to fix it. Unfortunately, as they approached Acton station, the rod broke. It caused an explosion of steam and fire from the engine. Despite their injuries, Walter and Harry did their utmost to bring the train to a stop. They were so badly burnt that when they were taken from Acton station to the St. Mary's Hospital, they died within the next 24 hours from their burns. Here in the bottom of this garden, you can see the remains of the foundations of a Roman wall. They are 1800 years old and were built with stones that came all the way from Kent. This wall is still the boundary of the City of London and has been used for over 1,000 years as in defence of the city. And when the fire of London in 1666 burnt through the city, it stopped the flames at the border of the wall. They didn't go any further into the rest of the city. Here we are in Greyfriars. It's so named because of a Franciscan monastery that was on this site from 1228 onwards. The monastery that was built here stayed here up until the Great Fire of London, and it was populated by the monks who wore grey, hence the name Greyfriars. Unfortunately, in the Great Fire of London in 1666, which is very notorious, the monastery was burnt down and they decided to rebuild a church on the site. Now, the person who got that contract was Christopher Wren, who is very famous for many churches in London. In fact, he was the architect for over 50 churches in the City of London alone. You can see this church currently does not have a roof, and it has not had a roof since a very terrible night in 1940. This was one of the worst nights of the Blitz during the Second World War. In one night alone, more than 10,000 firebombs were dropped. 16.5 tons of explosive. In that one night, on the 29th of December 1940, 8 of Christopher Wren's churches were destroyed. This one remains as a monument to what happened during the Blitz. So here we are at St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's has been at the centre of London life for millennia. The Saxons built their church here in 604, and that stood on the site until 842, when the Vikings invaded, burnt the Saxon church down and rebuilt their own. This happened again in 1066, when the Normans invaded England and decided that the old style of church was not satisfactory for the new modern Norman ways. Once the Normans had built their church in 1066, it stood here until the Great Fire of London in 1666, when the city around it was burning and the people tried to protect their beloved church from the fire, and they fought the fire for 4 to 5 days, just trying to keep this monument safe. Unfortunately, eventually it did succumb to the flames of the fire and the building crumbled. After that, the very famous architect Christopher Wren, who built so many of London's churches, had the opportunity to rebuild London's most iconic cathedral. It's a very different style from the previous Norman building, and he drew a lot of influence from the Italian arch in Rome and many ancient Roman buildings that were still standing in Rome during his education. You can see the classical style in the columns and the dome, and it was an entirely new style for England as a whole. During the Second World War, it was protected by an organisation called St. Paul's Watch, where many people risked their lives night after night, protecting the church from fires that were raging all around the city from the bombing that was happening. On one occasion, a bomb did pierce the dome of the cathedral, but it did not collapse and the bomb did not go off once it was inside. But fortunately, they were able to defuse the bomb, and we still have St. Paul's Cathedral today. There's a very iconic picture of St. Paul's dome standing proud above the ruins of the city after the Second World War. It's been an icon of a phoenix rising from the ashes, that it was able to survive despite the devastation around it. So here we are on the corner of Newgate. Newgate is so named for the new gate in the Roman wall that was placed here a very long time ago. That no longer exists, but there is, on this site for a very long time, was a notorious prison known as the Newgate Prison. Many criminals were charged and imprisoned here. One of the most famous criminals of the time was a gentleman called Jack Sheppard. Jack Sheppard escaped from Newgate Prison twice. He was notorious for escaping from many prisons, as he was arrested 8 times and escaped 7 of them. Today on this site stands the Old Bailey. It was built in 1906 and over the last century has been host to many of Britain's most famous criminal trials. The Old Bailey is also where the trials of many prominent IRA members were taking place in the 1970s. In 1973, the IRA let off a car bomb outside the courtroom while the proceedings were going on. It was the largest explosion they ever let off in the City of London, and shrapnel from the explosion can still be seen in the facade and the ceiling of the Old Bailey. Here we have the first drinking fountain installed in the City of London. At the time, in 1859, most people would be drinking a weak beer instead of water because the alcohol would kill off many of the diseases. Many of the water sources in London carried with it the risk of cholera or other diseases. This fountain was installed by the Temperance Society, who wanted to give people an alternative clean water source to drink from instead of just for beer. Here we are at St. Bart's Hospital. It was founded by a monk named Raher in 1123. Raher was on a pilgrimage to Rome. Along the way, he was struck down with malaria and became very ill. One night, he had a vision of St. Bartholomew speaking to him. The saint said that he would heal Raher, and then he must return to London and set up a hospital to treat the sick in the city. And in 1123, he started a priory here, known as St. Bartholomew's Priory, with 8 monks and 8 nuns, and they started to serve the sick and the wounded of the city. The priory grew into a hospital, and it was so popular at the time of Henry VIII that it survived the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry VIII gave St. Bart's Priory his seal of approval by putting his statue on the front gate. This is the only statue of Henry VIII still standing. Since that time, the hospital has continued to grow. Many advancements in medical knowledge have been made here. In 1609, William Harvey discovered how blood circulated around the body. In 1881, Ethel Fenwick founded the profession of nursing. And in 1895, the first X-rays were used here. This hospital is still a world leader in cancer research and treatment.